Chapter 2, the Research Enterprise in Psychology. Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. What are the advantages, goals, and the main assumption of the scientific approach in psychology? What are the 4 descriptive correlational research methods? What is a correlation coefficient? What does it tell you about the type and the strength of a relationship between variables? What are the major advantages and disadvantages of descriptive correlational research? So this is based on an actual study. The sources at the bottom of the slide. A female student approaches a male student on campus. She says she's noticed him around and finds him attractive. So Clark and Hatfield had set the study up so that their confederates, that is, these research assistants, position themselves on campus. In this instance, it was a female research assistant and asked a male passerby these questions. So one group was asked this question: would you go out with me tonight? Another group was asked, would you come over to my apartment tonight? A third group was asked, would you go to bed with me tonight? And then the tables were turned and males asked female students the same questions. So what do you suppose the results look like? So let's take a look. So the purple bars are the men saying yes, and on the y-axis here you have the percent of men saying yes, and then on the x-axis here you have the question: date, apartment, sex. And then the light blue bars are the women percentage saying yes. So let's look at this. Date, about 50-50. Apartment, we see a fairly large difference between the percentage of men saying yes and the percentage of female saying yes. So 60 and 6%. And then when we get the question of would you go to bed with me tonight, we see 0 women, 75% men. So the question becomes why? So this is a study that's been replicated in a number of different countries, different samples, and so forth. And it's a pretty reliable finding that you see these fairly consistent patterns in what's termed short-term mating strategies across gender. That is, men are more likely to say yes when it comes to having a one-night stand than women. And that's a pretty clear and reliable finding. So the question, as psychologists becomes, and people are interested in this sort of thing, becomes why? Why do we see this pattern? So this is pretty much a descriptive study, but yet it reveals something sort of basic about human behavior that we might be interested in finding out something about. So the question becomes, why would somebody do research on this anyway? Isn't this just kind of common sense? Well, not really. There's a couple of different brands of research: basic and applied. Think of basic research as doing research with the view to finding out knowledge for knowledge's sake. That is, you're curious and you want to find out what makes something tick. You're interested in coming up with an explanation for some phenomenon. So basic researchers are conducting research with a view to creating knowledge simply to find out. Knowledge for knowledge's sake. Whereas people that do applied research are interested in how the findings of their studies might be applied to the solution of real-world problems. So, for example, in this study, we might be interested in identifying differences in males and females' mating strategies. We might be interested in the conditions under which people will engage in possibly risky sexual behaviors in an era of STDs and AIDS in particular. So there's some basic research that we can do to identify consistent patterns in sexual behavior across gender, and then we might be able to take some of those findings and apply them in the solution of real-world problems. So basic and applied research. Let's talk a little bit about the scientific approach in psychology. And we'll start by looking at some claims that you might have some understanding of. So 1, eating sugar causes children to become temporarily hyperactive. True? False? 2, most people use only 10% or less of their brains. Waking a sleepwalker is dangerous. So just consider these statements and the extent to which you buy into them. Do you believe they're true or possibly false? The fact is that none of them are true. At best, the jury is still out. Inconclusive. But these are common beliefs that people might have based on their own experience. For example, eating sugar causes children to become temporarily hyperactive is almost common knowledge. When I was raising my daughter, I constantly heard people saying, "Oh, I wouldn't give little Johnny a cookie before he goes to bed because he'll be bouncing off the walls. He'll never go to sleep." But there's no good evidence to suggest that eating sugar causes children to become temporarily hyperactive. So, to some extent, it's a myth. Some questions we want solid answers to. We want reliable knowledge that we can count on that will inform decision-making, taking action of some kind, and that will be true across time. If I understand that eating sugar causes children to become temporarily hyperactive based on my own experience, based on stories other people have told me, then that's anecdotal evidence. It's got no scientific basis to it whatsoever. It hasn't been established through rigorous scientific investigation. Scientific approach has certain advantages over this sort of anecdotal, common sense evidence. Sometimes there's things we want to know that the knowledge that's being created, when we find out, we want it to be pretty reliable and solid. So the scientific approach has the advantage of being more clear and more precise than anecdotal evidence, and also there's an intolerance of error. So let's start with the first one, clarity and precision. Let's look at number 1, eating sugar causes children to become temporarily hyperactive. So a scientist would look at this statement and say, all right, well, let's define our terms. Eating sugar, what does that mean? Does that mean you sit them down with a 10-pound bag of C&H and a spoon, or do you give them a cookie? Causes, what does that mean? Is cause defined as in the billiard ball hitting the other billiard ball sense of causality, or is it that eating sugar increases the likelihood that kids will become hyperactive? What does cause mean? Children, are we talking about 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 17-year-olds? Temporarily, are we talking about 10 seconds or 30 minutes or an hour? Hyperactive, are we talking about people that are clinically diagnosable with ADHD, or that they're just moving around a bit more? And by the way, kids will move around a bit more, some kids anyway, when it comes time to go to bed because they don't want to go to bed. So we have to be really clear about what exactly it is that constitutes the question that we're asking before we can even begin to design a study such that we can get an answer to that question. So clarity and precision. And then intolerance of error sort of follows from that clarity and precision. That is, once we've taken the trouble of conducting the study and carefully analyzing our data, we want to be pretty confident that the answers that we're producing are relatively error-free. So a little bit more here about the scientific approach. What's the most basic assumption of science? And this is in your text. The most basic assumption of science is that events are governed by some lawful order. So as the astrophysicists look out into the heavens and try to discern the movement of the heavenly bodies and all the laws of nature and so forth that are functioning in the management of our physical universe, the psychologist is interested in human behavior and believes that not all human behavior is occurring sort of willy-nilly, but rather human behavior is explainable because it is following some discernible pattern. There's some lawful order to human behavior. You've got to be confident in this belief in order to do the research that will identify reliable patterns in behavior and replicable patterns in human behavior. So the idea is that events are governed by some lawful order. Some of the basic goals: measurement, description, understanding and prediction, application and control. So let's start with the first one. Let's say we're interested in studying racial prejudice. Prejudice is something that permeates United States culture as well as cultures around the world. But before we study it, we have to be really clear about what it is that we're talking about, racial prejudice. So we've got to come up with a definition of it and some way to measure it. Who has more of it than others, for example? Understanding and prediction. Once I understand possibly the factors that might set the stage for prejudicial sentiments, feelings about another that are negative based on that person's racial group, once I understand that, I might be able to predict the circumstances under which prejudicial sentiments may be more or less likely to occur. And if I can do that, here's the last part, application and control. If I know the conditions that set the stage for racial prejudice, maybe I can do something to keep it from happening. Application and control. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the most common research methods used in the behavioral sciences and probably in the sciences in general. Experimentation and descriptive methods. Experimentation we'll cover in lecture 2. Descriptive methods we're going to cover in this lecture. So descriptive methods include naturalistic observation, survey research, case studies, and correlational studies. So we're going to talk about each one of these in turn, starting with naturalistic observation. A study was done by a well-known social psychologist known as Leon Festinger. Festinger's at Stanford now, but back in the 50s, Festinger and his colleagues came across an article in a newspaper about a cult. And this cult was led by a woman named Mrs. Keach. And Mrs. Keach claimed to have been communicating with aliens, and these aliens said that the world's going to end. And anyone that joined the cult would be privy to information about a time and a place where the flying saucers would come, and they would get on the flying saucer and they would leave the Earth, and then the Earth would explode and they would be saved. So this cult predicted the world would end. And Festinger viewed this as an opportunity to enter the cult under false pretenses. They deceived the individuals in the cult into thinking that they were indeed interested in joining the cult, but what they were really interested in is finding out what happened, what would happen to the cult members in terms of their allegiance to the cult and other factors when prophecy failed. What would happen when the day the Earth was supposed to end and the flying saucers were supposed to come and take everybody away, the faithful? What would happen when nothing happened? Would their allegiance to the group increase? Would it decrease? What would happen? So sure enough, the day the world was to end rolled around, and sure enough, the world kept on spinning. Flying saucers never showed up. And many people were disappointed because they thought that there was going to be a big event, but nothing happened. They waited patiently, nothing happened. Then what happened? Well, some people left. They left the cult believing that they'd probably wasted their time. However, many people stuck around. Not only did their belief in the cult and Mrs. Keach's predictions and communications increase, but rather they went out and began to try to recruit new cult members. Increase their numbers, because certainly their time would come. So Festinger wrote a little book called When Prophecy Fails based on his study, and this study actually became the basis of one of the most productive theories in social psychology, which is a subdiscipline of the broad discipline of psychology. And this theoretical area is called cognitive dissonance. And basically it has the idea, what happens when something we believe in with all our hearts and all our minds is proven to be false? Will we change our attitudes towards the belief? Will we change our beliefs, or what would happen? And what Festinger showed is that once somebody is invested in a particular belief, it's almost impossible to divest them of that belief, and that's what was happening here. So anyway, this is an example of a study in naturalistic observation. Festinger and his colleagues got themselves into the cult under false pretenses, and then they sat back and they watched and they observed what would happen. There's other kinds of naturalistic observation that don't involve joining cults. Certainly if you're interested in the playground behavior among third grade boys, then you'd have to go to a school and get all the permissions and so forth, and then plant yourself in the schoolyard and make your systematic observations of the social life of third graders. And there's many, many other examples of naturalistic observation. But essentially it's a descriptive technique. You have an idea about what it is that you want to capture, the questions that you want to answer, and then you go out and you take a look. So that's naturalistic observation. Survey research, my hunch is that most people are familiar with. You've taken a web survey or a phone survey or a paper pencil survey at one point. So typically these are the administration methods of surveys. The advantage of surveys is that you can get a lot of data very, very quickly. Relative to experimentation, which we'll look at in Lecture 2, survey research is done in a sort of a quick and dirty fashion. Good surveys are difficult to develop. It takes a lot of time to develop a good survey, but once you have a good survey, they're relatively easy to administer, particularly on the web, and it's relatively easy to collect and analyze data. The disadvantage includes sampling issues and what's called socially desirable responding. Sampling issues is that perhaps you are interested in polling, for example, the pool from the population of prospective voters, and just by chance you happen to get 80% Republicans in your sample. Well, that would skew the data. So you've got to be really, really systematic in the way that you go about obtaining your sample. Socially desirable responding has to do with the honesty of the respondents' responses. Often people, particularly when the questions are sensitive, will skew their answers such that anybody who's looking at the survey will see them in a positive light. So there's things that we'll do to maintain our positive self-image, and also to make sure that other people are viewing us positively. So socially desirable responding is something that you got to be careful of. Case studies. The woman that you see in this image is Bertha Pappenheim. She was the subject of one of the classic case studies by Sigmund Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer. Anna O was the pseudonym that was used in this case study. Freud and Breuer were working with Anna O. She was a upper middle class Viennese woman suffering from a whole constellation of symptoms: paralysis of her limbs, being unable to take liquids at some times or food, deafness, blindness, this whole host of symptoms that the doctors could find absolutely no organic basis for these, no biological or physiological basis of these symptoms. So they had to conclude that it was mental. When they allowed Anna O to talk about her emotional life and her past and so forth, they noticed that it resulted in a reduction of her symptoms. Anna O also noted that it had helped her feel better, and she coined the term the talking cure. And this case study is a classic because this case study with Anna O formed the basis of all insight or talk therapy that came thereafter. So from this study, Freud developed his method of psychoanalysis, talk therapy. And we won't get to that stuff until chapter 15, but this is a very important case study in clinical and counseling psychology, and psychiatry as well. So a case study is an in-depth report, typically concerning one person. In this case, it was Bertha Pappenheim. The advantage is that we can find interesting new things on unique cases, and often doctors will get together and publish case studies. Disadvantage is the small sample size, so if we're focusing on one person, that's essentially an N of 1, as they say in statistics. We have one person, which is often highly subjective, so it's me interacting with this individual, forming my own subjective impressions. And then the last is that it's difficult to generalize the results based on an N of 1. So typically the solution is, if I find an interesting case, a single case, then I want to go out, possibly publish my case study, and then see if anybody else reports similar patients and clients and so forth, and then who knows, maybe you'd be on to something. Or you could include more people in a second study. So a little concept check here. Starbucks wanted to assess the way its customers were being treated in several of its less profitable stores. Several researchers were hired to act as customers and to record the way Starbucks personnel interacted with customers. Is this A, a study of naturalistic observation, B, a survey study, C, a case study? The answer is A, naturalistic observation. So the clue is that they hired these researchers to act as customers. So the last method we want to talk about in this lecture is correlation. And correlational methods are a research design that's often used in psychology. It's also a statistical method. So what does it mean to say that we have a correlation between two variables? My guess is that many people have heard of this term correlation. They use it without really even understanding what it means. They just know that something goes together with something else. So hopping on the zombie craze here, we've got a graph here. On the x-axis, we've got how much of a zombie you are, going from on the left, not so much of a zombie over here to the right, to being a full zombie. And then on the y-axis here we have number of brains eaten. So the correlation here is described as a positive one between brains and zombies. So we could say that brains eaten varies as a function of how much of a zombie you are, such that the more of a zombie you are, the greater number of brains you are eating. So this is an example of a positive correlation. I'm kind of jumping the gun. I want to get at these one by one. So there's a couple of different brands of correlation. We've got positive ones and negative ones. Let's talk about the positive one first. So a positive correlation, sometimes referred to as a direct correlation, that indicates that as scores on one variable go up, scores on the other variable tends to go up too. So here we're seeing hours studied. As hours studies go up on the x-axis, what do we see happening to scores over here on grade? So they're going up in a consistent fashion too, such that less studying tends to be associated with lower grades, whereas more studying tends to be associated with higher grades. So this would be a positive or a direct correlation. Negative correlation is just the opposite, sometimes referred to as inverse. So that means as x goes up, what do we see happening to y? Scores are going down. So let's take a look on the x-axis here. We have drinks per week. So the more drinking that's being done is associated with lower GPA, whereas people are not drinking so much have higher GPAs. So negative and positive correlations. The thing about correlations and their types is that you have to sort of jettison the ordinary sense of the words positive and negative. Think of positive as simply when one variable changes, that goes from low to high, what do we see happening to values on the other variable? They're going up in a consistent fashion. Whereas in negative correlation, it's just the opposite. As scores on x go up, what do we see happening to scores on y? They're going down. So direct, indirect, or inverse. positive and negative. So take a minute, you can pause this if you want, and come up with your own examples of a positive and negative correlation that may pertain to psychology. So think of some of these variables that you might be familiar with in psychology, intelligence, for example, or self-esteem, and think about how they might go together. Can you think of a couple of variables that would yield a positive association? Can you think of a couple of variables that would yield a negative association? Correlation coefficient. So there's a little number that you get when you do a correlational analysis. The actual analyses are beyond the scope of this class. You wouldn't actually get into the correlation coefficients computation unless you took a statistics class. But for our purposes, here's what we need to know. We know that there's negative and positive correlations. So those are the two brands of correlations. So along with that, you get a little number that will vary between 0 and 1, whether it's a negative association or a positive association. So correlation coefficients, whether negative or positive, will vary anywhere between 0 and negative 1 if it's negative, 0 and positive 1 if it's positive. So it's the absolute value of these numbers that we care about. The larger the number is, the stronger the relationship. So a correlation coefficient over here that's positive and it has an absolute value of 0.10, that would be a fairly weak, not very strong association, whereas somewhere around 0.5 is considered to be moderately strong, and then up here as we head towards 1, those correlation coefficients indicate a very strong relationship. Same thing over here, negative. Same sort of deal. A negative 0.10, the absolute value is 0.10, so that would be a weak or very low association between the two variables. Negative 0.5 would be moderate, and then negative 1 would be as good as it gets. So the larger the absolute value of the correlation coefficient, the stronger the relationship is. The sign, positive or negative, just tells us what type of correlation it is. So we're looking at a strong positive correlation here between hours studied and grades. So R is the notation for the correlation coefficient. So this is telling us that when we look at that graph, that the correlation between hours studied and grade is 0.89, which is pretty darn strong. There's really something going on there, we'd have to conclude. They go together. So take a minute and pause this if you want and elaborate. Consider the strength of your own example. So you came up with a positive and negative correlation. See if you can attach a strength, low, moderate, high. And by elaborating, you're helping yourself encode this information into memory, and it also helps in comprehension. Correlation and prediction. So here's one of the utilities of correlation. That is, if we understand what somebody is scoring on some X variable, we can often predict with a certain degree of accuracy what they're going to score on some Y variable. And it all depends, the accuracy of those predictions depends on the strength of the relationship. So we can use correlation to make predictions. So let's take a look at some of these correlations. We've got our various measures here, and we've got year 1 GPA. That's year 1 in college. And let's just take a look at high school GPA and first year college GPA. It's 0.67. So that's a pretty darn strong correlation, positive 0.67. So that means the higher somebody's scoring on their high school GPA, the higher they're tending to score their freshman year GPA. Then we can see here that drinking down here, I don't know how they measured this, probably the number of drinks per week or something like that. We can see that it's negatively correlated with first year GPA. So all that means is that the more somebody drinks or reports that they drink, the lower their GPA tends to be. So the thing about prediction is this: the stronger the correlation coefficient, the stronger the relationship, the more accurate the predictions that can be made. So this is why college admissions committees are interested in looking at high school GPA, because they know that if somebody's scoring pretty high on their high school GPA, the chances are that they're going to score pretty high as well their freshman year. And that freshman year is a very, very crucial year, because a lot of people drop out. They decide, college isn't for me, if they don't do so well. And if you're admitted into a college, then the administrators usually want to keep you there. Concept check. A positive correlation 0.67 exists between marital satisfaction and the number of positive interactions between spouses. A negative correlation, negative 0.87, exists between marital satisfaction and the number of negative interactions between spouses. A, which relationship is the strongest? If you said the negative correlation, you are correct. If we consider the absolute value, 0.87 beats 0.67. Remember that the sign, positive or negative, just indicates the direction of the relationship, the type of relationship. B, in which relationship can the most accurate predictions of marital satisfaction be made? If you pick the negative correlation, you are correct. The stronger the correlation, the more accurate the predictions. Advantages and disadvantages of descriptive correlational methods. So one advantage is that we can explore questions that cannot be or would be difficult to examine experimentally. That is, for example, if I have an interest in seeing if there's anything going on between exposure to secondhand smoke and health problems, how would I do that? Well, suppose I get one group of people and I randomly assign them to the condition of coming to my laboratory for the next 5 years and inhaling deeply of cigarette smoke in an enclosed space. Whereas I have another group, a control group, studiously avoid exposure to secondhand smoke. And then I just count up how many health problems they have after 5 years of exposure or non-exposure. Now, this would be practically impossible, and it would also be ethically impossible. It would never pass. You'd never be able to do that. But that doesn't mean I'm any less interested in finding out if there's anything going on between exposure to secondhand smoke and health problems. So what do? Well, I could design a really good survey, administer the survey such that it taps exposure to secondhand smoke as well as health problems, and then I could correlate those data and see if there's anything going on. So the advantage is I really don't have to do anything to my research participants. I just develop good measures, get a nice large random sample, collect my data, and do my analyses. Disadvantage: cannot make causal, not casual, claims based on descriptive or correlational designs. That is, sometimes the most satisfying explanation of some phenomenon is what causes it. But in correlational descriptive methods, we can't make any claims as to what causes what. We'll just pick on correlation here for a minute. So a negative correlation, 0.87, exists between marital satisfaction and the number of negative interactions between spouses. We've seen this before. So why can't we say, based on this very, very strong correlation coefficient, that negative interactions cause marital satisfaction to be lower? Why can't we? Well, it has to do with the design. It has to do with the design. Correlation does not mean causation, because I don't know whether high levels of marital satisfaction cause somebody to argue more or have more negative interactions, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the negative interactions that cause high levels of marital satisfaction. So this is referred to as the directionality problem. Another example here, we have GPA and drinks per week, right? Negatively correlated, but I don't know whether having a lot of drinks per week causes somebody to have a low GPA, or a low GPA causes somebody to drink a lot. So we don't know the causal path. So on this basis, we cannot make any causal claims based on a correlational design, nor can we make any causal claims based on naturalistic observation. Cannot do it. Survey studies, if they're correlational or merely descriptive studies, can't make any causal claims. So this is what we covered. These are the learning objectives. Explain the advantages, goals, and the main assumption of the scientific approach in psychology. Describe, compare, and contrast the 4 descriptive correlational research methods. Understand thoroughly the concept of correlation and the correlation coefficient. Explain the major advantages and disadvantages of descriptive correlational research methods.